The standard liberal view is that the necessary condition for an acceptable social order is that it's based on consent. And so that's the way they sort of classify things. And if you go back to slavery, the big point about it was that it was involuntary. And however, if that was what was wrong with it, that would mean that voluntary slavery would be different and perhaps acceptable. And you would even have modern philosophers that say that if you have a civilized contract for slavery, like Robert Nozick at Harvard, who died in 2002, that should be an acceptable contract. But that was outlawed actually at the same time that involuntary slavery was outlawed in the United States. But there is this whole dark history, this whole hidden history, and that whole intellectual history is basically lost. You will not find that in any liberal intellectual history. You'll find it's just a simple-minded consent versus coercion. These people are coerced, and that's why it's wrong. And so you have to sort of rediscover that whole sophisticated defense of slavery based on voluntary contracts. The political form of the argument was that wherever monarchy or non-democratic government exists as a settled condition, then you have an implicit contract that the people accept that. And of course you have an army and you have a police force that keeps it settled. So it stays a settled condition, and wherever that existed, then the people have, as it were, given their consent to this set of arrangements, and that is sealed by the prescription of time, was the sort of phrase. And so it was an implicit contract of alienation. The king or the monarch or the sovereign wasn't governing in your name, in your interest, and you had accepted that condition, and if you don't like it, you can leave. The counter-argument developed not saying that this was coercive, but saying, let's reinterpret this contract as a contract of delegation. So democratic thought is not based on consent to the governed, it's based on consent to a constitution that is a delegation instead of a constitution that is an alienation. So what's wrong with the contract of alienation? And there the argument is that the sort of rights you have as making decisions, as being responsible for your actions, are part of being human. And no matter what contract you sign, you can sign a contract to be a horse or a donkey, you're still a human. But if you have this sort of legalized fraud that said, well, you obey your master, we will count that as your part of fulfilling the contract. And then the other part of fulfilling the contract is you only have the rights of a horse or a slave or whatever it is. And so that's basically legalized fraud. And so the inalienability there is not just a moral inalienability, it's a factual inalienability. You cannot turn yourself into a part-time horse by signing some contract and by doing some performance. You can obey your master. So to show people that obeying your employer really doesn't make you less of a human, you take the example of the hired criminal, you see. So when the person commits a crime at the behest of their employer, then the law says, oh, the contract is off, the whole fraud is off, you two responsible people, you work together to do this crime and you're both liable. Or the employee obeys the employer in the workplace and they're not committing crimes, they're just as co-responsible, but the law treats it totally different. Then the law says, oh, you're an employee now. That's the fraud. And that was the same as slavery. I mean, the abolitionists made quite a point about saying whenever the slave commits a crime, they suddenly become person, and they're treated as persons in law, and the law said that. I quote judges. But for civil law, where you don't commit crimes, then you're treated as a thing. So the fact that this is a fiction or fraud, this has been right through. The employment contract is the renting version of the voluntary slavery contract, or if you want to look at it as a political thing, it's the workplace version of the pactum subjectionis, not for the whole political sphere, but for the workplace. You've alienated your right to govern to the employer. So we're in this situation where we have corporations, which are communities of work, owned, and even that is a farce because with the public stock market, the people don't buy shares in a publicly traded company to exercise the vote. For example, if you took away the voting rights from General Motors shareholders, how long would it take for anybody to notice? Probably next year's shareholder meeting, people would show up. But nobody buys General Motors shares to vote them. It's just investment. So suppose we reconstitute the corporation saying, let's turn the myth into a reality that this is really just investment capital. These people are not owners in any sense. So that they become some sort of a variable income bond, the common shares I'm talking about. Turn them into variable income bonds or participating debentures, whatever you want to call it, some sort of thing where there's no vote attached to it, and then reassign the vote to the people that work in the corporation. So you reconstitute, you make a new constitution for the corporation. The way to make the changeover legally isn't the problem. It's just you can just turn the fiction that absentee shareholders are owners into the reality that they're actually absentee suppliers of capital, and they'll get a return on their capital and blah, blah, blah. And the real people that are the ones governed will then be endowed with the right to select the people that govern them. Doesn't mean everybody has equal authority in day-to-day decisions. There's a whole hierarchy there, but the hierarchy is a democratic one. This, by the way, is the way in which liberals avoid these questions, is they say, well, any company you need hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And so and you need to give up your rights. And they don't say, is the hierarchy one that's a hierarchy of delegation or one of alienation? What's happening now is that the employers have so much control and the labor movement is so weak that they're repackaging jobs into these little micro things and saying you're an independent contractor, and so you're paying your own costs and so forth, even though you have the sort of de facto. And this is what happened after slavery. When slavery was abolished, what happened next is slavery was recreated, but with a different legal package. You're an independent farmer, but you don't happen to own some land. So you can rent my land, pay me part of your crop, and it's called sharecropping, and you don't have seed, so I will give you some seed, and you owe at the company store, and I'll give you some fertilizer, and you owe the company store. So you end up in a situation where legally you're packaged as an independent farmer, but in fact it was now called debt peonage. What is happening now with Uber and all these, a lot of this gig economy stuff, is that they're, because the few advances the labor movement has made is to attach the benefits of the health benefits or 401k and so forth onto the employee role. They're saying, look, we're going to allow you to become an independent contractor. You don't have to be an employee of the trucking company. You could have your own truck. You could own your own taxi or your own car and so forth. So they're pushing back the gains the labor movement has made. My phrase is a sharing economy, a sharecropping by another name.